I don't want Mom and Dad to go in. Just go home. My son said that right outside his wedding ballroom, in the middle of a five-star hotel. I stood there, frozen. My wife tightened her grip on my hand, still holding the family gift we had kept for more than 40 years. People walked past us as if we didn't exist. Strangely, I didn't feel ashamed. What I felt was something else, a quiet irony. I had spent my entire life building a future for my son, only to find myself locked out on the very day he wore the most expensive suit of his life. Before I tell you what happened next, leave a comment and let me know where you're listening from. And if this story touches something inside you, subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next one. Now, let me tell you why that day became a moment I will never forget. I stood there for a few more seconds after his words landed, like a heavy door being pushed shut right in front of me. Music from the ballroom spilled into the carpeted hallway. Smooth, polished, cold. Laughter on the other side never stopped. No one noticed that outside that door 2 people had just been erased from their own son's life. I looked at Rose. Her dress had been carefully pressed the night before. She had chosen it slowly, changing her mind again and again, afraid she wouldn't look appropriate enough. When we were younger, I used to tell her those things didn't matter. Tonight, I understood she had known this world better than I ever did. Her hands trembled slightly, but she didn't cry. Rose has always been like that. She keeps everything inside, until there's no space left to hold it. Julian wouldn't look at us anymore. He turned his face away as if one more second of our presence might stain the picture he was trying to present to his in-laws. I saw Tiffany standing farther back next to a group of men in matching black suits. She didn't say a word. She only tilted her head. A very subtle signal. Moments later, a security guard stepped closer. Close enough for me to understand that I had become a problem, to be handled. I didn't argue. I didn't ask why. At my age, I've learned that some answers, even if you hear them, no longer matter. I only nodded, so lightly that I'm not even sure I actually did. Rose lowered her head and adjusted the small box in her hands. Inside was my father's old watch. He wore it his entire life. Before he passed, he told me to save it for his grandson, for the day he got married. Rose remembered that promise more clearly than I did. We turned and walked away. No one called after us. No one stopped us. The hallway felt unusually long. Each step echoed louder than the music behind us, and suddenly I realized this wasn't the first time I had walked away from a place I once believed belonged to me. It just hurt more this time, because I had built that place with my own hands over a lifetime of work. Only when the elevator doors closed did Rose finally let out a long breath. She asked softly, as if afraid to break something fragile. Did we do something wrong? I didn't answer right away. Instead, my mind drifted back more than 15 years. Late nights, driving home close to midnight, my hands still smelling of engine oil. Julian asleep at his desk, while I sat nearby calculating every tuition bill for the private school he attended. Back then, I believed that if I just pushed a little harder, my son would never have to bow his head to anyone. I remembered the day Julian got his first job in Chicago. He called me, his voice filled with a rare excitement. I was so proud that the next day I brought pastries to the workshop and shared them with everyone. What I didn't realize then was that as he rose higher, a quiet distance was opening between us. I kept talking about overtime shifts. He started talking about image, about impressions, about fitting in. The elevator reached the lobby. Crystal lights reflected off the polished marble floor. In the large mirror I saw Rose and myself, 2 older people standing side by side, dressed properly, yet completely out of place. I didn't feel angry. I just felt tired. Tired of trying for so long to be accepted, in a place that never truly had room for us. Outside the hotel, the Chicago night wind was colder than I expected. Rose held my arm tighter. I could feel her heartbeat, fast and shallow. I knew that if I stopped for even one more minute, she would break down. And I didn't want the only memory of our son's wedding to be my wife collapsing on the steps of a stranger's hotel. I opened the car door. Before getting in, I looked back at the building. The upper floors were still brightly lit. Somewhere inside, Julian was beginning a new life, without us. The thought no longer stunned me like it had moments earlier. Instead, something else began to form. Slowly, clearly. If my son could close that door so easily, then maybe it was time for me to learn how to stop standing outside waiting. I sat in the driver's seat and started the engine. Rose placed the small box on her lap, holding it with both hands, like she was holding a piece of the past. I didn't say that everything would be okay. I only said, let's go home. But in that very moment, I knew home no longer meant returning to the old house. Tonight, we didn't just leave a wedding. We left behind an illusion that had lasted for many years, and I understood this was only the beginning. The car pulled away from the hotel in silence. Streetlights slid across the windshield in long, steady streaks. Unhurried, I drove slower than usual. Not because I was tired, but because I needed time to put everything back where it belonged in my head. Rose sat beside me, staring out the window, saying nothing. She's always like that when she's trying to stay composed. I knew if I asked, she would say I'm fine, and that answer would close everything for the moment, without fixing anything. We stopped at a small gas station near the highway. I turned off the engine, but didn't get out right away. I looked at the dashboard. The fuel light blinked, a quiet reminder that a decision had to be made. Not just about filling the tank, but about where we were going next. Our home was in Detroit. That road was familiar, safe, and quiet. But the thought of going straight back there right now made me feel like I was accepting something I wasn't ready to accept yet. Rose turned toward me. She didn't ask anything. She just placed her hand over mine. That was enough to tell me she was waiting for my decision. In that moment, I realized I had spent too many years making every choice around Julian. I chose overtime for his future. I chose silence for his peace. And tonight I stood outside a closed door. Because of him, the one thing I had never truly done was choose for myself. And for the woman who had walked beside me for nearly half a lifetime. I took out my phone. The name on the screen was Ben. My younger brother lives in Miami, far from long winters and aging factories. Ben had always told me to slow down sooner, to live more for myself. I used to laugh thinking he didn't understand a father's responsibility. I pressed call before I could change my mind. Ben answered almost immediately. His voice came through, clear and relaxed, as if there were no thousands of miles between us. I didn't tell him every detail. I just said, "Tonight, I'm not going back to Detroit. If you've got room, let me and Rose come over for dinner." There was a short pause on the other end. Then Ben said, "That sounds right. Come on down. We'll call it a late 40th wedding anniversary." I hung up feeling like a knot that had been tied for too long had finally loosened. I turned to Rose. She looked at me a little surprised. When I told her we were heading south that very night, she didn't object. She only nodded. Slowly. I saw her shoulders drop just a bit, as if a weight had been set down. Maybe she needed a place to breathe, too, just like I did. We didn't go home. I drove straight to the airport, parked the car, changed our tickets. Everything moved faster than I expected. While waiting to board, I finally had time to look at the envelope in my jacket pocket. Inside was the money I had prepared as Julian's wedding gift. $50,000. I had saved it over many years, not for the amount, but for what it meant to hand it to my son on his big day. I took out the envelope and placed it on the small table in front of me. Rose saw it and understood immediately. She didn't ask what I planned to do. The silence between us no longer felt heavy. It felt like an agreement without words. And suddenly I realized, while I had been trying so hard to protect my image in other people's eyes, I was lucky to have someone who had never asked me to prove anything at all. The plane took off close to midnight. As we lifted from the ground, I watched the lights of Chicago grow smaller below. Somewhere down there, the wedding was still going on. The toasts were still being made, and my son was living in a world he believed stood higher than his past. I didn't feel abandoned anymore. Instead, I felt myself stepping out of a familiar circle, even though I had no idea what lay ahead. Miami greeted us with warm air and the smell of salt from the sea. Ben was waiting, hugging Rose first, then giving my back a solid pat. He didn't ask many questions. Ben has always been that way. He understands that some stories need time, and some don't need to be told at all. The next morning, Ben took us to the marina. His yacht was there, white, quiet, reflecting the early sunlight. I stepped onto the deck, feeling the wood beneath my feet. A strange feeling spread through me, not because of luxury, but because of being welcomed, of being in a place where no one judged where I came from. I told Ben I wanted to arrange a small dinner. No show, no appearances. Just an evening for Rose and me to mark 40 years together, in a way we never had before. Ben looked at me then at the envelope in my hand. He understood right away. "Leave it to me," he said. "Consider it the best investment you've ever made." When I signed the confirmation, a rare clarity settled in. That money was no longer a wedding gift. It became a quiet statement that my worth and Rose's didn't depend on whether we were invited into a gold-trimmed room or not. For the first time in many years, I wasn't waiting for anyone's approval. I only needed to know one thing, that I hadn't abandoned myself. That afternoon, as the sun began to tilt, I stood at the bow, looking out over the open water. Rose came to stand beside me. She rested her head on my shoulder, gently. Neither of us mentioned the wedding anymore. We talked about simple things, trips we had missed, evenings we had planned but never taken. In that moment, I understood something. Awakening doesn't arrive with grand declarations. It comes quietly, when you stop waiting for validation from those who have already turned away. And as the boat began to leave the dock, I knew this night wasn't an escape. It was another beginning. Quiet, but steady. For me, and for Rose, the boat eased away from the dock, slowly without making any real noise. The water split at the bow, then closed again behind us, as if nothing had ever passed through. I stood there for a long while, until the horizon settled into view. The feeling wasn't joy. It was lighter than that, like setting down something I had been carrying for far too long. Ben handled everything naturally, never making me feel like I was being helped. The guest list was short. No one came out of curiosity or obligation. They were people who had known me before I became a gray-haired old man. Some had worked the shop floor with me. Others had shared rushed lunches during short breaks. No one asked why the gathering was here, or why it was happening now. They simply showed up. The afternoon moved at an unhurried pace. Rose changed into a simpler dress. She no longer stood in front of the mirror for too long. I noticed something different in her eyes. Not exactly happiness, but no longer the fear of being judged. I saw it when she smiled at an old friend. A smile that didn't need anyone's permission. As the sun began to sink, Ben introduced me to a friend of his, a younger man comfortable with cameras and live streams. At first, I didn't pay much attention. To me, this was just a dinner. But when I saw him setting up his phone, checking the light, I asked Ben if it was really necessary. Ben shrugged. "Let things happen naturally," he said. I didn't object. I no longer felt the need to control everything the way I used to. When everyone had arrived, the lights on the deck came on. Soft, warm. There were no long speeches, no formal rituals. I raised my glass and said a few short words about 40 years gone by. I didn't mention the wedding in Chicago. I didn't need to. Sometimes the absence of a story speaks louder than the story itself. Rose stood beside me. When I finished, she touched my hand, just lightly. Enough to let me know she was here, and that was enough. I didn't feel the need to prove anything, not to the people standing in front of me, and not to those who weren't there. At some point, without me noticing, when the live stream began drawing more attention, I only realized it when a few guests whispered that people were commenting a lot. I glanced at the young man. He lifted his hand slightly, signaling that everything was fine, that nothing was being twisted. I turned away. I wasn't used to my life being seen through a screen, but I wasn't afraid of it anymore either. Fireworks went up just as the sky darkened. Not too big, not too long. Just enough for the light to reflect on the water, and on Rose's face. I looked at her in that moment, and realized it had been a long time since I had seen her this calm. Not because of the setting, but because she was no longer standing at the edge of any room. I sat down in a quiet corner of the deck away from the conversations. I needed some silence. The sea breeze was gentle, carrying the familiar smell of salt. I thought about Julian, but not with anger. I thought of him the way one thinks of a road that has split, and can no longer return to the same starting point. The phone in my pocket vibrated. I didn't check it right away. I've learned that not every signal needs an immediate response. When I finally looked, I saw notifications from people I didn't know. Comments, questions. I turned the screen off. I didn't want to read them now. Still, I couldn't ignore one thing. While we were sitting here at a gathering named after no one but ourselves, somewhere else this image was spreading. Not because of luxury, but because of contrast. An older couple marking 40 years together on a boat, without asking anyone for permission to be happy. Ben came and sat beside me. He handed me a glass of water. "You okay?" he asked. I nodded. I told him I never expected things to grow this big. Ben looked at me and smiled faintly. Some things hit people late, he said. Not because you're trying to prove anything, but because you're not hiding. As the evening slowly came to an end, guests left one by one. No one lingered too long. I liked that. Everything felt just right. Rose helped Ben tidy up a few small things. I watched them, and for the first time in many years, I didn't feel like the center of responsibility. I was just a husband, a brother, standing where I belonged. Before heading into the cabin to rest, I checked my phone one more time. This time I saw missed calls. Julian's name. Over and over. I didn't answer, not out of revenge, but because I knew if I answered right now, everything I had quietly built would be pulled back into an old spiral. I set the phone down and turned off the light. Outside, the sea continued its steady rhythm against the hull. Rose lay beside me, her breathing slow and deep. In the darkness, I thought about a paradox that had never been clearer. I was asked to leave a wedding to protect someone else's image. Yet it was only by leaving that I began to see my own. And I understood this much. What was spreading out there was only the surface. The real change wasn't on any screen. It was here, in the fact that I had stopped searching for a place in my son's life. I had straightened my back and stood fully in my own. And that alone, quiet as it was, had been enough to create a wave I never expected. I woke up just before dawn to the soft sound of waves tapping against the hull. Dim light filtered through the small curtain, just enough for me to see Rose sleeping peacefully. Her face looked more relaxed than it had in days. I sat up and reached for my phone on the table beside the bed. The screen lit up instantly, as if it had been waiting for me. There were more missed calls, more messages, this time not only from Julian. There were unfamiliar names, numbers I had never saved. I didn't open them right away. I made a cup of coffee and stepped out onto the deck. The morning wind was cool and direct. I needed a clear head before reading anything. Julian's first message was short and urgent. "Dad, where are you?" The next one came a few minutes later. "Something happened. Call me now." I read them slowly, not out of curiosity, but because I wanted to be steady before taking in what was coming. I scrolled. Longer messages began to appear. Julian wrote about Tiffany's family, about a dinner after the wedding, where things didn't go the way he expected. Questions started to surface. At first, polite, then probing. Someone placed a folder on the table. Information Julian had shared about his family, laid out, line by line. He had said I owned a large engineering company, that our family had long-standing business ties, that I lived simply by personal choice. Julian hadn't lied once. He had built an entire story, and the wedding was the stage that allowed it to exist. When the truth began to show, everything collapsed faster than I imagined. There were no raised voices, no dramatic scenes, just glances shifting away, sentences cut off midway, and a cold silence settling over the table. Julian wrote that Tiffany's family stopped responding right after. The honeymoon ended before it even began. I set the phone down. I didn't feel satisfied. I didn't feel the pain I thought I would. What I felt most clearly was distance, as if I were reading about someone else's life, not my son's. That afternoon, Julian called again. I didn't answer. He called again, and again. Finally, I sent a short message. "Tonight, the old dock, where I used to work. If you want to talk, come there." I didn't explain further. I didn't want this meeting in a polished place. I wanted it where everything once began. We left Miami that afternoon. Ben didn't ask much. He only said that if I needed more time, I could stay. I shook my head. Some things can't be postponed. Rose sat beside me the entire trip. She didn't ask what Julian had said. I knew she trusted me to do what was right. In my own way, the old dock was quiet when we arrived. The wooden planks had darkened with age. I had stood here for hours once, checking metal parts, inspecting joints. This place taught me precision and responsibility. I wanted Julian to see that. He arrived late. When Julian stepped out of the car, I noticed the change immediately. The expensive suit was gone. He wore a simple jacket, wrinkled. The confidence in his eyes was missing. He looked around, as if searching for an exit. Julian walked up to me and started talking right away. No greeting. His voice was rushed, scattered. He talked about pressure, about needing to fit in, about the fear of being looked down on. He said that if I helped him just this once, everything would be fine. He spoke nonstop, as if afraid that if he paused, I would turn away. I let him talk. I didn't interrupt. When he finally stopped to breathe, I spoke. I asked one question. "Do you remember why I chose to be an engineer?" Julian stayed silent. I continued. "Because if one bolt is placed wrong, the whole system will fail. Not immediately, but inevitably." Julian looked at me confused. I went on slowly. I told him I didn't blame him for wanting to go far. I blamed him for choosing to deny what had lifted him up. I told him pretending could open doors quickly, but it wouldn't keep anyone inside once the door closed. Julian shifted from pleading to anger. He called me selfish. He said I didn't understand his world. I listened, but I didn't follow him there. I had heard those words before, in many forms, for years. The difference today was that I no longer tried to defend myself. I reached into my jacket and took out a small box. Julian's eyes flickered with a familiar hope. I placed the box in his hand. I said nothing. I wanted him to open it in silence. When the lid lifted, I saw the expectation fade from his eyes. Inside was my father's old watch, and a folded paper. Julian picked it up and read. It was a document relinquishing inheritance rights to the old family house. There was no place for his signature. "Only mine," I said calmly. "You chose a life without your parents on your wedding day. I respect that choice. This is how I keep my word." I told him the watch was the only thing I was giving him back. Not as a reward, but as a reminder. That time does not stand on the side of pretending. Julian stood there, unable to speak. Wind moved across the river, rippling the surface. Rose stood beside me, silent. She didn't look at Julian. She looked toward the dock where the evening light was fading. When we turned away, Julian called after us. I didn't stop, not out of cruelty, but because I knew if I turned back one more time I would step into the old role again. And that role had ended, the night in Chicago. We got into the car. As we drove away, I glanced at the mirror. Julian was still standing there, growing smaller. I didn't know where his road would lead, but for the first time, I didn't feel responsible for every turn he might take. Night fell quickly. Rose placed her hand over mine. She didn't speak, and in that silence I understood. A chapter had closed, not with noise, but with a cold clarity, and that clarity was the hardest thing to accept. We left the dock when the sky had fully darkened. Streetlights reflected on the water behind us in broken streaks of light. I drove slowly, not because I was tired, but because there was nothing left to rush toward. The meeting we just had left no loud echo behind it. It felt like the closing of a final door, not locked, but no longer needing to be opened again. Rose leaned back in her seat, her hands resting quietly on her lap. She didn't ask if I was okay. After all these years, she knows some questions only make things heavier. I didn't ask what she was thinking either. We've learned how to sit beside each other without filling every space with words. Once we were out of the city, the road stretched straight and long. I turned the radio on briefly, then turned it off. The silence felt better than any sound. Julian no longer stood in my mind the way he had at the dock. Not because I was trying to forget him, but because I had placed him where he belonged. A part of the past, not something steering the present. We stopped at a small roadside cafe. No bright sign, no crowd. I ordered 2 cups of hot coffee. Rose looked around, then smiled softly. "It's been a long time since we stopped somewhere like this," she said. I nodded. I realized that for many years, all our stops had revolved around someone else's schedule. We sat by the window. I looked at Rose and saw the lines around her eyes clearly. They didn't make her look old. They showed that she had lived a long life, patiently. And suddenly, I understood something simple. The most precious thing I had ever held wasn't what I gave my son. It was the woman who had walked through everything with me, even when no one was watching. Back in the car, Rose asked quietly, "So, where do we go now?" I didn't answer right away. I thought about Detroit, the old house, rooms full of memories. Then I thought about the coastal road ahead, a road we had never driven together. I said, "Toward somewhere with a little more sunlight." Rose didn't ask anything else. She just nodded. The next morning we woke up in a small town. The sea there was calm. No noise. I opened the window and let the breeze fill the room. Rose had already been up making coffee. Watching her move slowly through that unfamiliar space, I saw it clearly. She didn't need a familiar place to feel safe. She only needed us, still side by side. In the days that followed, we made no big plans. We walked along the shore, ate simple meals, talked about things we'd skipped for years because we were too busy. No one called me anymore. The phone stayed quiet. I didn't feel empty. Instead, I felt like I was finally filling time I had always handed over to others. One afternoon, Rose took the old watch out of her bag and placed it in my hand. "Keep it," she said. "Not to remember, but to know where you are." I held the watch, feeling its familiar weight. Time was still moving, but it was no longer pushing me to chase expectations that were never mine. That evening, we sat on the balcony and watched the sun go down. I thought about Julian, not with anger, not with hope of fixing things. I thought of him as a grown man who had chosen his own road. It might be a hard one. He might have to learn things late, but that was no longer a burden I needed to carry for him. Rose rested her head on my shoulder. She said, "At least we taught him something, even if not the way he wanted." I understood. Some lessons don't come from giving more. They come from knowing when to stop. The day we started our drive back, I followed the coastline. Morning light stretched out ahead of us. I didn't know what the future would look like. I only knew this. This time I wasn't moving forward, feeling abandoned or rejected. I was moving forward with the calm of someone who had finally put everything in its right place. I used to think family had to be held on to at all costs. Now I understand. Family only exists where there is respect. When respect disappears, the only thing left to protect is your own dignity. The car moved steadily on. Rose looked at me and smiled softly. I took her hand and said nothing more. Some endings don't need promises. They don't need victories. They only need one simple thing: two people still brave enough to live kindly with each other after everything is closed. My story ends here. Thank you for taking the time to listen to the life of a stranger. If this story made you reflect, please like, subscribe, and share, so it can reach others who may be standing where we once stood. Not to blame anyone, but to remind ourselves of something simple. Family doesn't exist because of blood. It exists because of respect. Parents don't need to be worshipped. They only need not to be pushed away. And children, no matter how far they go, should never forget where they first learned to stand. Thank you for listening. I wish you dignity, and the people who truly matter always close by.